Welcome to SROA Soundboard, SROA's podcast for radiation oncology administrators. I'm Tammy McCausland, and I'm joined in conversation today with Dr. Michele Harper, an ER physician and author of The Beauty in Breaking. Welcome, Dr. Harper.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join you here today.
So your book is very interesting, and I was wondering if you could talk briefly about your upbringing and how it shaped you and led you to writing your book.
I would say that, well, there were various aspects of my upbringing, but, as I discuss in the memoir, I grew up in Washington, D.C. area, in an affluent part of D.C., and I will say that, when it comes to specifically, for example, going into emergency medicine, I grew up in an abusive household with a father who was a batterer. So, I often say that now in retrospect, I feel I was groomed to go into emergency medicine because there were so many instances where all I had was a snapshot in time, and I had to decide in the moment, are we likely to face danger, some imminent life threat? And when I say we, I mean my mother, my brother, my sister. Or is this, whatever scenario that's going on, is it likely to blow over? And it's not really going to be that dangerous to us physically in the moment. Or is this relative calm real? So this is a skill set I had to determine or hone when I was very young. And of course, it's applicable to emergency medicine. And I learned in my youth while going through that yes, my personal healing for people close to me is important, but also that I wanted to be there for people who are all seeking that for themselves, to be part of a support system and structure to offer that, because I believe that if we heal ourselves, we can then be there for others on their journey. And if we do that, then we can uplift society.
You mentioned that your upbringing kind of groomed you for emergency medicine, but was there one kind of defining moment that solidified it for you that, yes, this is what you wanted to do?
One moment. There was a moment that was quite defining. It's a memoir, so it's highly curated.
Mm-hmm.
There were various events, but one that really stayed with me. I talk about a time when my brother, he was about 8.5 years older than me. He was always, I felt, our protector. And when I was a young teenager, there was an instance when my brother was protecting my mother, and in the process of restraining my father bit him, and it was an injury to his hand. And I remember thinking in that moment, really just feeling in my body that if a family member, if your father could do this to a family member, there was really no safety there, and that we're going to have to find a way to protect ourselves. And, I talk about, because that's what I knew growing up. I didn't know much else. But a moment when I drove my brother to the emergency department to get care for his injury. And as I waited in the waiting room, and he was called back, I saw all manner of life converge there. Now, this was decades ago and pre-COVID, so people could wait in the waiting room, like the homeless man who was just looking for respite from the elements, who was going to have to figure out a way into the world after this, but for the time he could rest. Or like a little girl who was brought in crying by presumably her father. And then I saw her come out skipping and smiling. Or a man who was unconscious and EMS was pumping air into his lungs, beating his heart for him by pressing on his chest. And then his family members coming in, also looking for answers, hopefully looking to continue their lives with their family member brought in on a stretcher. But either way, they were going to have to find a way forward. And so seeing these various people at different points in their lives, all looking for some kind of salvation and knowing that it's possible in the moment, hopefully moving forward in the future, that was a real catalyst for me, where I knew that, despite what I had known growing up, despite what I saw in my home, healing was possible. I could do it for myself. And then again, yes, hopefully for others as well.
That's really interesting. So it's almost like in the physical healing that you saw in the emergency room, it kind of transformed probably emotional and mental and even physical healing for you. Mm-hmm. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, just cracked open this window so that I could see the potential of another way to be. And for me, the way that I wanted was healed. And you mentioned, yes, physically, but then, and I would argue even more importantly, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually.
While we're on this topic of healing, what does it mean to you to be a healer? And how do you think people can heal themselves based on your experience and what you've seen in your life?
And I love that question because I resonate with that term, healer, more than physician, because anyone can be a healer, and we can be a healer in any field. So I often think of artists as healers, and they're probably my favorite people. Mm-hmm. And if we're in tune enough, then yes, I think physicians can do it. Social workers, administrators, everyone, because I think it's really tending to pain, tending to trauma or any kind of injury, and then doing the work to make it better, to make it right. I think the work of a healer, it's not a one and done. It's a life work, and it never ends.
I would say there's some interesting parallels between emergency medicine and radiation oncology in that you see people at their, maybe not at their worst, maybe more so in emergency medicine, but there's a lot of people who pass through radiation oncology who aren't going to get better. They're definitely at their most vulnerable. So that I just wondered, based on your experience, what advice or what would you share with radiation oncologists that may be dealing with a similar vulnerable population, the similarity being, like I said, that emotional vulnerability and that fact that some may not get better and some may get better.
Right. And you're right. Whether or not someone is at their worst or lowest point, or their sickest or most critical state, they certainly feel that they are. Because I would agree, when we meet people in the ER, most people don't want to be there. So they're in a crisis state for them, whether or not it's, an actual heart attack or stroke or gunshot wound, or, which is common in this country, or they don't have access to health care. So they have nowhere else to go. Or they have insurance, but they can't get into their doctor or a specialist because people are often underinsured in this nation, which gets into a larger structural issue we can talk about later. But they certainly do feel that they're at their worst, and if there's a way that we can ease that discomfort and be present in the moment and provide the services they need in that moment, and they feel that they have partnership and an ally in that moment, it helps. Then I always say that, of course, that's not enough, right? I discussed an instance where I was meeting a young woman in the emergency department. She was coming in for medical clearance. She was going on to continue to work with her therapist, getting sober, overcoming significant PTSD. She's a veteran, and we spoke about, I was about to leave the room. My shift was running late, and I was just seeing an extra patient to help the doctor who was going to be there alone, to help all the patients waiting to be seen. But before leaving the room, I had asked her, I said, she had mentioned trauma she went through in the military, and if she wanted to discuss that further, that I was there to hear her. And she did want to discuss it, and that trauma was when her colleague and supervisor raped her while she was in the military, stationed overseas. And then after that, and the military tried to ruin her career. So now I was seeing her. She was reassigned to a new team who had reestablished her record so that she was in good standing. So after this crime against her body, she wouldn't then also lose her livelihood. And her new therapist was helping with her treatment. So, my listening to her, she expressed gratitude that we could have this conversation. She said she hadn't really told the whole story before, and she felt lighter as a result. And so, yeah, it was a good thing that I was willing to be there, to hold space for that pain, to express in no uncertain terms that what they did to her was wrong and she deserved to be able to move forward with her life. All of that was good. It's also not justice. I did not say to her in that moment because it wouldn't have been appropriate for the discussion. But I told the story, and I discussed in that chapter how justice is more than that. Certainly we need to do that for each other, but it's holding the men who did this accountable. It's holding the military accountable for allowing that toxic environment and for these crimes to happen. It's being involved, those of us who have any kind of privilege, those of us who aren't in the midst of fighting for our survival. The rest of us, it is working towards sustainable change.
It's a very powerful story. Also, you touch on interesting points that have come up, especially with COVID and even before COVID, the inequity in healthcare, and we've seen the inequity in cancer care. And I've interviewed people for articles that have talked about, how African Americans in particular have poor outcomes. And so you also raise an interesting point about, justice is more. It makes me think of, like the military should have a truth and reconciliation committee, like they did in apartheid, and they did that in Canada with the way the Indigenous people were treated in the residential schools. So it would be nice to see it in healthcare too, maybe, that where people could become, more aware, because I think when you're in the system, you don't necessarily know, maybe you want to evoke change, but you don't know how, or you just don't see the challenges. So I want to transition to what I thought was something very powerful that you wrote in your book. I think it's on point with what you've just talked about. You write, as a Black woman, I navigate an American landscape that claims to be post-racial, when every waking moment reveals the contrary, an American landscape that requires all women to pound tenaciously against a proverbial glass ceiling, which we've since discovered is made of palladium, the kind of glass that would sooner bow than shatter. Can you share what those words mean to you and what they mean in healthcare and in your job?
And I thought, as you were speaking about truth and reconciliation, and then that was actually a perfect segue into that quote. I think about the experiences that I've had over the years and continue with structural bigotry, and I discussed one of them when it came to seeking a promotion in the book, where I'm used to leadership positions. I enjoy it, and so I was an attending physician and love seeing patients. I also thought, beyond this, the one-on-one experience in the emergency department, maybe if I do administrative work, that will enhance the impact of this work. So I applied at that time for a hospital position. So I'd continue work in the ER clinically, and then also have this administrative role outside, like above and beyond my department. So I completed the interviews. I like meeting people. I like talking to people. I thought it was fun, process even. And then I just waited for the day of the decision. And I felt confident that I would get the role. And my director called me in and said, Michele, you are so qualified for this position. And you're actually the only applicant. But they decided they're not going to hire anyone. They're just going to leave it open for the time being. And then he went on to ask me, he said, Michele, I hope you'll stay on with me here. It's just that this hospital never promotes women or people of color. And so that's why they always leave. But I hope you'll stay anyway. And I did leave shortly after. Submitted my resignation. And because I still lived in the area and I still knew people at the hospital, I did find out that apparently they had decided not long after I left, well, it was now the perfect time to hire. And they hired someone for the role. It was a white male nurse. And so I bring that up because to highlight the structural problems. And it's not always a lack of knowledge. It's true. There are people who may not understand structural racism or misogyny. The list goes on, right? Just various components of historical structural bigotry in this country that are present day as well. That's true. But then there are times that people understand it and know it perfectly. And so the issue is not a lack of understanding. It's because it's not important for them to change it. And they feel somehow they benefit from it, so want to uphold it. Which brings us to how holding systems accountable is important, because you don't have to care in order to be held accountable. And we just know that outcomes are better when there's diversity and inclusion, when people are respected and valued. When we take the bigotry out of it, there are better health outcomes. Groups are more productive. I mean, we just all win with it. And that's the key. We all win with it. So instead of concentrating power in a very small group of people, and then all of society pays a price from it, there's another way that is possible if we just do the work to achieve it.
So how do you feel when you know this is obvious, the systemic issues are obvious, there's poor health outcomes for African Americans and people of color, and in some ways it feels like raging against the machine because you want to effect change. So how do you function and continue to do what you do given experiences like that where you were told you're qualified but we're not hiring? I mean, doesn't it make you want to quit sometimes?
Yeah. And I just want to say, these poor outcomes are for everyone. I'm doing this interesting research and reading, and I just have to point this out. There are studies that have been done where it looks at inequality in societies, like whether it's cities, countries. The data just always bears out where there's the more financially unequal a society, the worse the outcomes are, and that's true even if you stratify based on income. So I was looking at this research these researchers in the UK are doing. So when they did a graph and plotted pretty well-off nations, like wealthy nations with the U.S., the U.S. ranks the most unequal and has the worst outcome at every level. Like rich people in our society have higher rates of mortality, suicide, substance abuse, incarceration, all of them. Like when it comes to various medical pathology as well, we do worse than people in other countries. There is something about the inequality that is just bad. I think we know spiritually it's bad for everyone, but based on these other indicators, it's also bad for everyone. So knowing that this has been and is happening in this country, then how do I keep going to work? I'll say that, well, we have problems in medicine. We have these same issues in every, we talk about policing. We have it there. We talk about criminal justice. We have it there. We see it in various parts of education. It really is everywhere throughout society. So practically speaking, I can't just quit my job and think there's going to be some amazing, fair job somewhere else. I mean, if people know about it, they can contact me on social media and just let me know what that field is. But I think this is work, I believe, is worthwhile for us all to do in every field. And the reason I keep at it, while I'm a realist, I think on social media I say that I'm an occasional optimist and constant abolitionist. And it's true because I do have hope. We have made progress over time. I know it is incremental. I know that at times it can feel like 2 steps forward and 10 steps backwards, but it's still possible. And so because I know it's possible, and because I know it's worthwhile, and because I know the alternative is not, that I keep at it.
Would you say you're also intrinsically motivated by the power of connection and empathy that you feel with the people that come into your care?
I think I am intrinsically motivated. Yes. I mean, I would say that, but I feel that way about humanity in general. And actually that's why it was important for me. Yes, it's a memoir. Yes. I kind of start, the initial chapters are focused on me and aspects of my life. But then the structure is every chapter is one or sometimes a couple people's names. And then it delves deeply into individual patient stories with information about me and my experience woven throughout the narrative. And I did that on purpose because I believe in our interconnectedness as human beings. And I can't just consider myself. I couldn't just write a book about myself without speaking about other people, because I honor that connection, and I find it so critical in how I see the world and experience the world, that's why I chose the structure of the book, and that, yes, that is what motivates me to do this work.
So how did you get to the point in your life where you decided, I need to write about my experiences?
There were stories that just stuck with me. In residency, really that's when the seeds of the idea of doing a book started. Whether it was a woman who was brought in to one of the trauma bays, covered in cuts all over her body, small cuts all over her body. Turns out an ex-partner did this to her. And she was going to survive. None of the cuts were life-threatening. But I thought, what would drive this man to behave in this way? What made him do this? Why did he think it was acceptable to do this? What about their lives brought them together in the first place? Sure, how do we address this in the ER? How do we address this as a society? And then how is she going to recover from what will certainly be scars all over her body? And then the psychic ones that we can't see. So it was experiences like that I wanted to explore through writing. And I felt that they could be healing, as we keep talking about, for people who read them. Because, there's nothing, people like to say we're, unique, like snowflakes. We're not really unique as human beings. There are common themes that run throughout all of our lives. And in telling these stories and in amplifying the voices of people who are traditionally silenced, I think there's a lot that we can learn by listening, by hearing, by experiencing them in this way that can be freeing. And I'll also say that I was the kind of person who always, I told you artists are my favorite people. I would always hang out with artists and activists. My favorite place to spend time pre-COVID, and hopefully to be coming back soon, were our art museums. So it's, I feel like it was inevitable that somehow I would become more actively involved in some area of art. And for me, the literary world is what felt most natural now.
Do you have plans to write another book?
I do have plans. So part of my process, so it turns out, part of my process is I will not talk about a project until it's done. I also haven't fully formulated this idea, so I couldn't really talk about it, but I will say that it is in the works, and the greatest barrier right now is just time, but I'm actively working on it to carve out that space to get it done.
And I think that's great, because I read, some sections of your book that were available to me, and your prose is beautiful, so I think it's great that you are going to do something else. I was curious about the title, The Beauty in Breaking. How did that come about?
So, I'm not one to romanticize trauma because that's sick. But I do have respect for the fact that, part of this deal of being human is that painful and otherwise challenging things will happen within our control and that have nothing to do with our control. They will happen in life. And then it's true what they say. What is important then is how we handle those situations and experiences. I mentioned in the book this, and I apologize because I try as I might. I know I will always mispronounce the word, but the Japanese art of kinzakuroi, and in that process, pottery that has been broken is repaired, specifically repaired with an amalgam of precious metals, whether that's platinum, yellow gold, silver, because the thinking is that repairing it in this way, you're highlighting the cracks, like this vessel that was torn apart by the mutability of life. Well, now we we honor what it's been through. We see it, we acknowledge it, we understand it. And it's even more beautiful now for the repair, for what it has gone through, and now the repair. And I feel that human beings are the same. If, depending how we choose to repair ourselves, we really can be more brilliant, insightful, and beautiful for what we've overcome.
And that's the beauty in life, except it's also the challenge, because sometimes people don't come back from the breaking, and sometimes people do.
Right.
Just two more questions, if you don't mind. What lessons or messages can administrative leaders and maybe anyone working in the front lines of healthcare take from your book?
And that's a good question, actually, and that was worded really well, because I'm often asked the question, what do I want people to take from my book? And I just raised that point because it's so important for me that people will receive the messages they need at the time that's perfect for them. Now, whether or not they listen is something else. But so I think that there's so many different messages there, and depending where we're on in life, that's the one that will resonate. And for me, we've touched on this a little bit before, but my guiding principles are our interconnectedness as humans, that beneath this skin, we all look the same in terms of flesh and bone and blood. It's all the same. And then my guiding principles in life in general are this commitment to radical honesty. And it takes a lot of courage to be honest, to bear witness and just be honest about what is happening. And then to go on to have the bravery to act from that place of honesty. So it's always my hope for myself that I'm radically honest and that I'm brave enough to have integrity. And so I would say because of that, if somebody gets that from my book, then I would be thrilled. That's, for me, those are the most important principles in life for me.
Those are great principles to have, and I agree with you. Radical honesty does take a lot of courage, and sometimes brutal. I think there's a difference between radical honesty and brutal honesty.
Well, that's true too.
What do you hope for the future of healthcare?
What I hope for the future of healthcare is that it truly delivers just that it delivers healthcare, that in this country we decide, we agree that healthcare is a right, and therefore everyone deserves to have healthcare at all times, and that they deserve to have quality healthcare, that there is equity in it, and that it is high quality. That's it. That's all I want for healthcare.
Hope that we achieve it. Thank you very much, and have a blessed day.
You too. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to SROA Soundboard. We hope you will join us again. For more information, visit www.sroa.org.